Let me, if I can, before we begin, we're going to give you a quick overview of kind of what LNG is. You'll probably have more technical expertise. Mine, of course, is Mr. Tierney and others on my staff. I know the topic pretty well, I should say, but he's certainly ready to answer questions as well. But at the outset, my basic, and I say my, I mean my office's basis for objecting to the placement of this of this station or site is that it is woefully ill-conceived and frankly a knee-jerk reaction to being denied access to a land-based facility in Fall River. As you know, they've basically moved it just offshore, about 70 yards across the Rhode Island border in the middle of Mount Hope Bay. There are three basic reasons. I'll probably revisit them periodically, either in my presentation over the next several minutes or in responses to you. Three basic reasons that I have cited repeatedly over the years in innumerable forums on behalf of the people of the state for why I object to these LNG transports. The first one, which I'll touch on a little bit more extensively in a few moments, and I really want to get through it quickly, is usually the last one I go to, but I'll mention it first, and that's kind of the health and safety issue in a post-9/11 world. I have never, chose to think about or use the fact that, some devastation may occur and we should all run for the hills and don't bring it in here. I, in fact, repeatedly have said in committees like this and stood with, Rep. Gallison was here and so many others in this state, other states, Washington and beyond, in discussing this, that I want to, hold hands with everyone and assume it never happens. Even if you do, the 3 points of concern are still health and safety costs, and I'll expand on that, the cost to every community. Because of the nature of the threat. The second would be the one that impresses people the least, or at least most people. Certainly I'm not indicating you as members of this committee who care about this topic, but publicly the one that rings the least number of bells, or the bell for people, is environmental concerns. Normally they just don't excite people, and I know there are some good folks in here from Save the Bay and the Conservation Law Foundation and others, but the reality is, in spite of this being incredibly devastating to our environment, it just doesn't really excite people enough to say no. The last one is probably the most important one, and I'll touch it here and then I'll probably finish with it, and that's why so many of the fine people behind me are assembled, I presume, and that's the economics of it. There is a socioeconomic part that is incorporated that we have to think of, the closing of bridges and the inconvenience and things that it would cause, but specifically jobs. And it is my, from every document that has been prepared from the Aquidneck Island Planning Commission that talks about the incredible loss of jobs and devastation to our economy, to any region that you talk about and the impact that these would have. While the prospect of building a facility in a short term would bring jobs, which are so very, very, very important to the fine men and women who represent the hardworking men and women in this state, the reality is that most of them would be in the short term. And that's something we all need to work on, is making sure we have jobs for those that are represented in here and those that couldn't make it today. And I've done that repeatedly in my capacity as the Attorney General. But there are innumerable points of concern that I have that overall our economy in the long run, and frankly, the numbers of jobs, even in those that are represented today, would diminish when you look at it played out across all 15 communities that would be dissected by these mammoth ships as they came into our waterways. With that said, we'll turn now, if we can. Naturally, we can make copies of this available, and we'll give it to your staff. I believe it already has been given to your staff. A quick thing about LNG, I'm not certain of who has been in here from a science perspective to tell you what it is, but basically, LNG is liquefied natural gas. It is cooled to 260 degrees below zero, which reduces the size of the gas particles incredibly, allowing massive quantities of the material to be stored. Due to extreme low temperature of the gas, it immediately boils when it comes into contact with the air. If the liquid form of the natural gas comes in contact with water, it results in an explosive liquid to a gas vaporization. Vapor clouds are capable of drifting far from the site of breach and can be ignited miles away. One of the reasons we hit, and in the next few slides, we're going to go through them as quickly as possible so we don't go too far, but this kind of sums up the creation of the cloud and when cold LNG hits much warmer water, a violent vaporization leads to explosions. Large vapor clouds they can travel miles. I would just say at this point, that, and we have a report that I don't have a copy now, but I'll get one to you, Mr. Chairman, and other members of the committee, and we'll make it available. It's actually available on websites. We can get it to you. But I brought in Richard Clark, who was a former national intelligence czar for 2 different presidents. One of the last, I think, 5 people literally in the White House when 9/11 hit, and they evacuated the Capitol. And when he was called, it's on like page 13 of his book, Against All Enemies, which I happen to be reading entirely coincidentally. And when he's called by the president and asked what they should do as it was unfolding, he said, well, the first thing we have to do is close the harbors down, particularly those with LNG facilities. With that said, and with that in mind, I don't think we need to look at that picture, other than that's an illustration of just kind of the size and the expansion of it. With that said, we brought him in with a team of specialists from MIT and Harvard, and they set about to do a report that dovetailed and expanded upon a report that had been done earlier in the 90s, which was called the Sandia Report, and we'll touch upon that very briefly later. In any event, he looked at and examined the impact of possible explosions if they occurred, and piercings of the vessel, and it talked about how dramatic and disastrous it would be. The reality is, now again, this is that first point that all of us want to assume. I've sat with Gordon Shearer from the industry, and I say, listen, all of us want to assume, pray that it never happens. This is important to think about because of the rules and regulations that then would have a reverberating effect on the other key things that I talked about, namely the socioeconomic impacts because of the exclusion zones, which we'll talk about in a minute. One of the first things that they talk about is that it's never happened. And the reality is they're wrong. It has happened on different occasions historically. We've noted them on January 19th in Algeria. A steam boiler was part of an LNG liquefaction production plant exploded, triggering a second, more massive vapor cloud explosion. Massive destruction. We can go to the next picture, which we don't want to linger on. We can go to the Cove Point, Maryland, in October of '79. An explosion occurred within an electrical substation. LNG leaked through its seal, vaporized, passed through 200 feet of underground conduit. The use of the circuit breaker ignited the natural gas and it exploded. Pipeline explosion in Edison, New Jersey. 30 miles from Midtown, a 36-inch buried pipeline causing what was described as blinding, scorching nuclear heat. The reality is, on minimal things occurring, like a circuit breaker, massive damage has occurred, and it just illustrates what scientists have illustrated. The Sandia Report speaks to at length, and I presume your committee at some point will take a long look at it. The Sandia National Lab, which I referred to, I was wrong actually, it was 2004. They talk about a fire size depends on the number of LNG compartments breached. The simultaneous breach of up to 3 LNG compartments is deemed credible. That was the type of breach that Richard Clark and his team considered out of 5 possible compartments that Clark looked at. He used the Sandia numbers. Frankly, most would argue if 3 go, all 5 are going to go, but nonetheless, they are separately compartmentalized. And the radiation poses a major threat to people up to a mile away. Now, Weaver's Cove initial proposal. If I could get up from the table, I wanted to show, I have 2, I don't know if Joey can give me a couple things. We have smaller versions of these, but it's important for us as Rhode Islanders to kind of look at